Welcome to Harshniyam Podcast. The guest for this episode is KE Semmel. KE Semmel spoke to us about his life in literature and his debut novel, The Book of Losman. Semmel is a writer and a translator from Danish to English. His fiction and non-fiction have appeared in Lithub, The Millions, Electric Literature, The Writer's Chronicle, Washington Post, and elsewhere. In the book, Daniel Losman, an American translator living a solitary life in Copenhagen, grapples with loneliness after his girlfriend's departure. His only solace comes from his 3-year-old son, whom he fears may inherit his Tourette Syndrome, a neurological disorder characterized by involuntary movements and sounds. When he learns of a groundbreaking drug trial promising to address the root of his condition by accessing childhood memories, Losman, despite his initial skepticism, finds himself drawn in. The unexpected consequences of his participation form the heart of this compelling novel. You can buy the Book of Losman and the books by Danish writer Simon Froland as mentioned in the podcast using the link given in the show notes. Please rate Harshniyam Podcast on Spotify and Apple apps. I gather that you loved playing chess when you were in school. How did you get into reading?
As a kid, my brothers were both very good athletes. I was a good athlete, but not like they were, and so chess was kind of my way to beat them because I could beat them in chess, and it was fun. And I like any kid, teenager type kid in high school. I read what was assigned in classes. I didn't do a whole lot of reading outside of high school, in all honesty. That is to say, outside of classes. And it wasn't until I got to college that I truly got into reading and got really hooked on reading. And it was with short stories in particular that got me hooked. When I was in, between years in college, I had to work over the summers to help pay for college, essentially. And my father was a big reader, and he was a truck driver, and he would give me books and suggestions on what I should read. And those were kind of formative experiences for me, and sharing, some of his interests in literature. And, a lot of what he read was, there were books from, German books, so books in translation, but he was really kind of interested in German and European literature. So, some of my fondest memories are those days when I had to go to work with my dad. He would get up at 4 a.m. So I would get up at 4 a.m. and I would go to work with him, but I would take a book or two and I would sit there for 2 hours until my shift started, and I would be reading books. And I spent a lot of time reading books in translation, whether it's Thomas Mann, de Maupassant, I'm trying to think, Hermann Hesse. I read a lot back then. Basically, a lot of things that he was really into, and I kind of went from there.
That's nice. Now, you say that your biggest literary influence, interestingly, is Bob Dylan, right?
Yes, that is 100% true. So Dylan is really, in my mind, the greatest American living artist. And I think he has demonstrated over his 60 years as in the industry, as a musician, as an artist, as a writer, that he has enormous staying power, and also his vision, which has shifted over the years, but his vision has been pretty consistent throughout. But at the same time, he has not been tied down to any one particular pathway. And so I think the best artists are the artists who are willing to take a fresh look at their work and recast it and to change it. Whether it's Miles Davis, Nick Cave. I'm just thinking some musicians here. I mean, Joyce Carol Oates in the U.S., I think she does an excellent job of writing very different stories. And, you could the list goes on of writers and musicians who do this. But Dylan to me is the preeminent version of that. And I just found his music to be so incredibly stimulating, and his lyrics, in particular, because he is so imagistic, and his the way he puts words together is simply a phenomenal thing. And I also, frankly, I like the way his mannerisms, just generally, how he puts his art out there and he doesn't really talk about it. I think that's got to be, for any artist, that's got to be the dream scenario, where you don't have to actually talk about what you've just produced. Which is not to say it's not. This is very fun, and all this is very fun. But you just don't have to when you're Bob Dylan, and it's pretty wild. But I honestly, though, I think he embodies the artistic spirit, and you see that in his art, his sculpture, his visual art, and not just in his music, but he just embodies the artistic spirit. And I think for me, so much about what makes life interesting and exciting is the artistic spirit and being able to create stuff.
Now the next question has two parts. How did you become a translator? You talked about musicians primarily. Now, how does your taste in music stimulate translation?
Okay, so I'll start with that first part. So essentially, it's a fairly prosaic answer, but as I mentioned earlier, literature has obviously been a big thing since college. I read every day quite a bit, and have been for 30 some odd years. I studied German. In graduate school, I met a woman from Denmark, and then we got together and we moved to Denmark. And so because I had the German background, because I studied German, and obviously I was a native English speaker with an interest in literature, it simply kind of went from there, where I picked up the language fairly quickly. I worked as a mailman in Denmark, and so I was actively involved in the community, so to speak. And so I picked it up fairly quickly, and I wanted always really to translate in some capacity, because I think translation is so much about being a better reader, being a better writer, and I was all about that. I wanted to experience what that was like, and it was and that's how I got into it. I found a writer by the name of Simon Frulund, whose work is very influential to the Book of Losman, and I just started one day, and I just sat down, and I translated a couple of stories from his opening book, his first book, a collection of stories called Milk. And I sent the pages to him. He really enjoyed it, and we've been friends ever since. And I've translated 3 of his books now, and each of them have in some way influenced the Book of Losman, just as my conversations with Simon about literature, about fiction, about Denmark, whatever it is, it's been influential in my development as well. And he's another writer who has really altered his work from the beginning to today. He went from being a kind of Raymond Carver / Ernest Hemingway type short story writer to being more of a David Markson type of writer with more of a pointillist style, minimalist, very interesting stuff he's been doing in recent vintage.
So basically he's a minimalist?
I would say very much so. Simon, you mean?
Yeah, Simon, yes.
Yes, yeah, I would say very much. Even in his short stories, the early work that were, that I described as kind of Carveresque, those stories those are really short stories, so 4, 5, 6 pages long, that occur under a kind of a small amount of time. So, an hour may pass, a couple hours, at most a day, but not a whole lot in terms of time passes. And the sentences are very, very spare, purposefully so. And he's really kind of a master, I think, at writing very compact sentences. And he's got a good sense of humor, one that is might be easily missed if you don't pay attention to it. And as a translator, that is often a difficult thing to translate, is that kind of, colloquial sense of humor, which I'm sure you've talked to translators who've talked about this before. It's not an easy thing to do. The second part of your question was about music and how music informs my translation work. Okay. I think it informs my work just as a writer, translation or writing aside, whether it's either or. It is there's a musicality in language, and this is not a new thought, but there's a musicality to it. And I listen to music every day, just like a lot of people. And for me, it is about kind of arranging words and sentences in a text in a way that sounds good, that's musical, that has a rhythm, a beat. And so I think music informs my translation in that way. It's about developing a sense of rhythm, developing a sense of timing and phrasing that actually works in language, in written language. I only write or translate in prose, so it has to work in that sense. And I think music is a way, particularly with lyrics, is a way to kind of analyze, but not in a really, it's almost like a passive way. You're just kind of getting a sense of you're absorbing on a daily basis, how others put words and sentences and phrases together. And I think that's how it informs my translation, because, translating from one language to another requires you're taking the music of one language and making music in another language, because obviously a literal translation is going to have no music, and so that's how I would answer that question, I think.
I will come to Simon again later in the later part of the interview. Tell us about your journey as a writer. I think this novel was in the making, and you said you wrote that 17 drafts you have done for this particular novel altogether, and the total period of writing it took from day one to the publishing. I think it took about 5 years.
More like 7 years, but that the last 2 years were post acceptance by the publisher. So, as you know, the whole process of when your book is, it takes its time. This particular book didn't take 17 drafts. It was my previous book. So I've written ever since college, and I've written numerous and thousands of pages of fiction and multiple manuscripts. And this was the first one that actually got published. So, but my previous book was a retelling of Beowulf as a crime novel, and it was set in the Western New York region where I live, Western New York State. And I did about 17 different drafts of that, and it ranged from first person to third person, one character to four. It ended up being four. There were characters who came and characters who went, who just got excised, thousands of pages, and eventually I settled on a manuscript that I thought worked at the time. It even landed me an agent, and the agent shopped it around, and I got I think it was like 45 or 47. I can't remember the exact number. Rejections from major publishers. And they all, with the exception of one, they all really liked the book, and they even said as much. They said, Semmel's a good writer. This is a compelling story. I read it. I don't always read all the full submissions that I'm going to reject, but I read this one and I kind of enjoyed it. So I got some really good feedback. It's just that nobody was willing to take a risk on publishing it, and I think part of that is the changing landscape of the publishing industry, where it's more of a challenge, I think, for young or emerging, however you want to define this, writers who haven't published their first book, who maybe don't have the same level of platform, whether it's thousands of followers on TikTok or a byline in a major newspaper. If you don't have those sorts of things, it is, I think, a challenge to break through in today's market. I can't speak for what it's like in India, but I suspect something is very similar throughout the world in terms of how difficult it is to find that audience. Because, well, I won't get into the why because of this, but I do think it's a challenge. And so that was what I faced. And so with Losman, after spending 10 years on my previous book, the Beowulf retelling, I thought, I'm going to tell a story that I don't have to spend 10 years writing. And, with the Book of with the Beowulf retelling, there was a lot of involved in that. I had to do a lot of research on character, on the topic, which was about oil extraction in the state of New York, and of course on Beowulf. So I wanted to get all these parts together, and it took a long time until I finally found something. I even had at one time, I even tried to write it in the kind of old English poetry style that Beowulf was written in, and that didn't work. But anyway, I just wanted to write something that was shorter and didn't take 10 years of my life. And so that's, I've had these tics all my life, and, I'm familiar with Denmark. I'm familiar with Copenhagen. I'm familiar with translation. And I thought, you know what, I will write this novel, and I will make it much shorter, and I won't spend 10 years of my life. And that's how the Book of Losman came about. And that's the basic nutshell of my writing career, I suppose.
Yeah, now I see off late, I have seen Anton Herr publishing his own book, Jennifer Craft, again. And Damien Sills, of course, his second book recently, it has come out. We interviewed him recently. Now, you're all successful, really successful as translators, right? Why this compelling urge to be a writer?
Well, that's a great question. And I think that, so I've written about translation as well. And I wrote a piece for the Millions about debut novelists, or not just debut novelists, but translators who wrote fiction. So Jennifer Croft, Idra Novi, and Bruna Dantas Labato, each of whom are fantastic writers and translators. And they all said something very similar to what my experience has been. It's like, before we were translators, we wanted to be writers. We were writers first. And we kind of got into translation because we were interested in reading, because we were interested in writing, because we have the language background that would allow us to do the work. And so I think, in a sense, the question is, more like, why did we get into translation? Okay. because translation takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of time away from your actual, creative writing. We don't get the kind of credit as a translator. And in fact, I always like to joke that the only time we get noticed in a book is if we've done something that the reader disagree with. Like I remember I had one book, I won't say what it is, but I misspelled a word. This is a 110,000 word novel, and I misspelled one word, and I had a gleeful I got a gleeful response from some reader pointing out that I misspelled this word. Not a word about whether she enjoyed the book. She clearly enjoyed the book, based on her response, but like that one word, she was happy that she could point that out to me. It is funny. It cracks me up that people just they will latch onto the one thing that they find that they can correct a person on. So
now we will get into the book. Please introduce Daniel P. Losman to our readers.
All right. So Daniel P. Losman, who goes mostly by the name of Losman, is a literary translator in Copenhagen, Denmark. He has Tourette Syndrome, and he gets involved in a rather dubious drug trial that promises to provide him with a cure for his Tourette syndrome. And this is something that he has long, or he doesn't want to have these tics. These tics can be debilitating for him. And they certainly mean for him that he's not a very outgoing person. He's kind of a lonely person. He's an anxious person. And so he sees this possible drug as a way of overcoming the Tourette and becoming a whole person. The problem with the drug is that it's a pill that you take that allows you, the user, to relive, so to speak, your childhood memories. And the idea of the researchers is that you, by taking this pill, will discover the traumas that may have caused some that in Losman's specific case, that may have caused his Tourette syndrome to manifest. But they claim, of course, and the researchers, that there may be other conditions that might be made manifest by taking this pill and reliving these childhood memories. So this is a somewhat dubious proposition, but this is where the speculative nature of the book comes into play, because I long wanted to write this story. I've had 20 years ago, roughly, I came up with an idea of, some would say came up with an idea, but I had an idea that what if there was a pill that you could take to relive those childhood memories, things you forget. I often think about this. Like, there's so many things, and I had my son is going on 14 now, and I used to think about how all these wonderful memories that I was having of him as a toddler, that he would never remember those things. And I think what a shame that is, and so I had this idea about this pill, but I didn't know what to do with it. And so eventually, when I was officially diagnosed with Tourette's in around 2016, that's when I realized that now I had a vehicle to talk about or to use this pill idea, because what if, I've long wondered why I have these tics. I can also control them fairly well in public settings. But I've long wondered why I had them. And so this was like, well, maybe I can explore the idea by revisiting my childhood memories fictionally, and now I should stress that these aren't my childhood memories. These are all invented memories. There's a scene in which a doctor performs a circumcision on the boy here. And that wasn't me.
Okay. When you mentioned in the afterword that Simon Fruland, the writer, Danish writer, is a big influence on while you were writing the book,
Mm-hmm.
The Book of Losman. How so?
The opening chapter of the book, of my book, The Book of Losman, is called Kramer is Dead. And technically, that's the opening section is called Kramer is Dead. The first chapter is essentially a retelling of Simon's short story, Kramer. So Kramer, in Simon's original story, which is about 4 pages long, there's a young woman in the story, and there's a kind of a drunken old man. And the story takes place mostly on the stairwell in their apartment building. And so what happens is this young woman discovers Kramer sitting on the stairwell, sleeping. And she helps him up and helps him to his apartment. But after she takes him to his door and she's walking back towards her apartment, he does something. He basically pulls down his pants and masturbates in front of her. And that story is, to me, it's a very vivid story. And it's one that, when I first read it, I certainly didn't anticipate that that's how it would end, that he would do that. Because he comes across in the beginning of the story as just a drunken, sad guy. And then that kind of action takes him well past being a sad guy and into a kind of disturbing, disgusting guy. And this is one of the fewer stories in the collection that takes place over more than one day, because we discover the following morning that essentially she hears a thump, and Kramer when she goes up to check on him, there's no sound, there's nothing coming out of his door, and she calls essentially the ambulance, and they discover he's dead. And so all that premise is essentially the very premise, as you've now read the Book of Losman, so you understand that's essentially the opening scene of Losman. And so I asked Simon his permission to do this, and he also read the book in its early manuscript and provided feedback, and really appreciated that connection there. So what I really wanted to have fun with this novel, and so essentially Losman is essentially inserted into Simon's story. He's the translator who's translating the book, so to speak, because there's a reference later on in the novel. I don't know if you recall when Losman is sitting with his dad, he hands his dad a book. So, but it describes the exact cover of Simon's story, Milk. So there's a bit of a metafiction going on in the novel that I just had fun with, and Caroline, in my version of Kramer's story, she gets a much larger role. She's a very small character in a short story, but in my novel, she basically becomes Losman's love interest, if you want to put it in those terms. She also absorbs a trait from another character in Milk. There's a story called Crossing, in which a woman dresses up in clothes for a boyfriend. And so throughout, Caroline is kind of doing some of that stuff as well. So I think that's how specifically Simon's work influenced me. And then in a more subtle way, in his book, The World in Varvara, Simon's book, that book is about a young writer who is hired to write a memoir for an eccentric 79-and-a-half-year-old actress in Denmark. And he kind of fails at the job. In some ways, he's very much like Losman. He fails at the job, but he has the publisher who's paid him his money is kind of hounding him and trying to get the pages done, and he wants to see them. And so that kind of attitude also finds its way into Losman. So little things like that, the subtle little things that I spent so many years working on Simon's work. I've been so enthralled by Simon's work over the years that I've gone out and I've translated on my own. I've not been paid for the most part to do these projects. I did get an NEA, National Endowment for the Arts fellowship to translate Simon's work, but it's not a lucrative business. There's not an advance from a major publisher asking for me to translate this book. It's just because I love the work, and so I've been really engaged with it for many years. And so it's not surprising that Simon has influenced me in such a way.
Yeah, it's really nicely written. There is an emotion, there is a lot of humor, sarcasm. More than anything else, it talks about a health disorder, which we don't know much about. And I have one of my friends who faces the similar issue. So I know a bit about it. You have given a lot of details in the book too. And there is a very nice afterword to the book, which puts everything in a proper context.
Well, I appreciate that. I actually I had some doubts of whether I should include that afterword in the book. At least the way I wrote it, I feel as though I reveal quite a bit at the end, and part of me is always, I want to maintain the veneer of fiction, because it is fiction, of course, and so my concern was that by doing that, people might read it as this is my story, and obviously, given what happens in the book, it's not my story, and yet I couldn't help but think that people may read it as such. So I'm glad I included it in the end, but it was a big consideration whether I should do that.
One of the major themes of the book is Tourette Syndrome that Losman suffers from. What does the latest research say about it?
The latest research that I'm aware of, and there's a lot, that comes out is that nobody really knows why people tick. There are people who have what I would term a milder version of it, and that would be me. I would always, my wife would disagree with me, but I feel as though the urges I have for ticking are milder in comparison to someone, say, who has coprolalia, which is the more publicly facing version of it, where people, where you might shout or swear, you have an urge to shout or swear in public. I've never had that to that level. I certainly have, when I do tick, it's very much an urge. You sense that you have to do it, and that you get this kind of like it's almost like a switch that says, okay, it's going to happen. You're going to do this. That's my experience with it, and I haven't always kept abreast on the latest research, mostly because there is so much of there's I have a Google alert on Tourette, and what I get is a lot of clinical trials or studies, and no one really, to my knowledge, there's no clarity in any of that stuff just yet. Who knows how long it'll be? There are pills you can take that are supposedly helpful in managing your tics. Guanfacine was one I took. Risperidone is another that I'm familiar with. I didn't feel that the guanfacine did anything for me, and the risperidone is my understanding, it's an antipsychotic. I could be wrong about that, but it is nevertheless one that has side effects, and I guess I was always more concerned about the side effects than the actual tics. But again, I haven't had I don't have the very visible, incredibly visible public tics that people with coprolalia have. So I can't speak to whether or not such pills do the kind of work necessary to help manage your tics in public. I could see if I had such tics that if those pills worked to control those urges, then I would take them too. But I've been lucky in that even though I've had these since I was a kid, and it certainly has influenced who I am as a person and how I interact with other people, and when I interact with other people, I think in many ways I've been very lucky in my situation.
You mentioned about that Lintrix one zine, right? That part is fictional, or
yeah, that is actually real. That is a thing that is that they are studying, that may have a correlation with Tourette's. And it was something I learned through my doctor, actually, who also has Tourette's. He was explaining this to me, that this is something that people are looking at. But again, I think we're probably years away from any sort of connection that might be confirmed or rejected. It just struck me as like, that is something that if Losman learned that, he would be very interested in that. And then it goes back to that. I definitely wanted to include that because it goes back to the book itself as a kind of text, and Losman himself as a kind of text. That's, the Book of Losman is, the references throughout the book to writing, to revising, and that's a perfect example because Losman then wonders, what does it mean to have your DNA, or sorry, your genome modified, and is it like revising a text? So that to me was just a really nice confluence of fact and fiction.
What are you currently working on?
Yeah, I want to get back and write another novel, but I have been very focused on this particular one, and trying to spread the word as much as possible. I have a great publisher, SFWP. It's a small press, though. And so, like with all writers these days, no matter who you are, you have to do a lot of the footwork. Even if you're publishing with one of the big five, I mean, it is a different environment than it was, say, 20 years ago. And so I'm happy to do that. But at the same time, that does require a lot of work. And I have a full-time job, a job that I love. And so I do feel kind of pulled in multiple directions on a daily basis. So I haven't been writing as much these days. I can say that I'm not translating anymore. I'm really trying to focus as much as possible on writing. So I do plan to write an essay soon. And I won't get too many details about that because I'm always superstitious about that. Because if I start talking about it, then I won't do it. And I do plan on writing one beginning later this month.
That author that you translated.
Niels H. Peterson.
Yeah, Peterson, yeah. Yes. I thought he's real.
He is not real. I think of American sitcoms, and I don't know if it's the same in India, but there are times when the sitcom characters are so over the top that they couldn't possibly be real. And I amuse myself with that. And so essentially he is, in my mind, like an American sitcom character. He's just over the top. And I had fun writing him, actually.
No, even in India, things are even worse. We call them TV serials.
Okay.
They're still worse.
This has come up before, and like to me, this is a bit of a I wouldn't say a throwaway thing, but it's a smaller portion of the book, and I do want to make it very clear that I've not worked with a writer in any way, shape, or form who is like this guy. And I've only worked. Honestly, I've enjoyed all the writers I've worked with, and I don't always communicate with everyone that I've worked with. That's just not how it is. But the ones that I have communicated with have none have been like this guy.
One of the funniest chapters, one of the funniest parts of the book is chapter 2. How you started? Could you please read a couple of pages?
This is I have to admit, I wasn't sure how translators and publishers might take to this, because it just seems like I might be, I don't know, it was a little too sarcastic, perhaps.
You want to read a different portion? I have no objection.
No, I'm happy to read this. I am happy to read this. But it is definitely one where I wanted to. I felt it was important for people to understand just why Losman struggled with this particular book. So this was my way of doing that. So this is chapter 2. It's about a page that I'll read here. This is after the Losman and Caroline, his neighbor, found the dead guy. They found Kramer in his apartment, and Kramer's been taken away, and Losman is at this point no longer really able to focus on the translation because his whole days. After the emergency crew had left, Losman tried to work on the translation, but he couldn't focus. He cracked open a beer, drained it quickly, and drank another. He snorted and puffed and jerked his head, once, twice, a third time, until he'd temporarily satisfied the urge in his brain. Already he'd wasted 4 hours that day subjected to the miserable, regurgitated prose of this no-good, horrible heap of rot. Niels H. Peterson's debut novel of insufferable pomposity called Jeg slår deg ihjel. The novel was about a gruff old detective named Niels P., who tracks down a serial killer, only to discover that the serial killer was his split personality, P. Nielsen. So far, Losman had rendered the title directly as I Am Going to Kill You. Since the book was slowly killing Losman, it seemed a fitting title. Somehow, the novel had garnered excellent reviews in fawning Danish newspapers and subsequently sold a bunch of copies to unsuspecting readers. A British publisher, like a pig feeding at the trough, then bought the rights and hired Losman. He would have said, no way am I translating this trash, but the money was very good, and he needed it. Peterson had followed up this debut with a novel called Terror, a sequel whose premise was even more batshit. After inexplicably avoiding jail time for murdering 6 women in I Am Going to Kill You, Niels P. and P. Nielsen partner to track down a serial rapist who terrorizes the city of Aarhus and who turns out, equally inexplicably, to be a radicalized Muslim immigrant. The launch party for this second novel was tonight, and Losman had been invited by the publisher. He'd accepted the invitation because if he wanted to translate other books, and how else was he going to earn a living? He had to play nice. As a translator, Losman felt most days like a lowly scribe in some damp, chilly medieval monastery, forced to copy, at great personal cost, every ridiculous page. Laboriously he plotted his way through one sentence after another. His syntax bothered him. The sentences were like a Mr. Potato Head with its parts in all the wrong places. It made him anxious to think that he wouldn't get all his pages done today. It meant he would have to translate 14 pages tomorrow, or 4 pages on the weekend to catch up, to stay on schedule. But he couldn't concentrate. He pictured Kramer slumping up the stairs, breathing heavily, beer bottles clinking in his hand. He pictured him on the landing with his lovely young neighbor. He pictured his lonely final hours, and he couldn't help but wonder if Kramer really had killed himself. When his thoughts turned to how desperate a man would have to be to end his own life, Losman backed away from his computer and decided it was time for a mind-cleansing jog.